The room was beautiful. Golden lights hung from the ceiling. Families were smiling. Conversations floated from table to table. Everything looked perfect on the surface. And in the middle of that room, your person was sitting across from someone new. Someone their family believed was perfect. Someone successful. Someone impressive. Someone they were being encouraged to consider for marriage. At first, your person tried to be polite. They smiled. They answered questions. They listened. But something strange kept happening. No matter how hard they tried to focus on the person sitting across from them, their mind kept drifting somewhere else. To someone else. To you. They hated it. Because they had promised themselves they were moving on. They had promised themselves they were finally ready to let go. Yet every answer they gave, every laugh they forced, every future they imagined, somehow led back to you. And then something happened that nobody in that room expected. Something that changed the entire atmosphere. Something that made time feel as if it had frozen. Because a relative stood up and said, "Before anyone makes any decisions, there's something everyone should hear." The room became quiet. People looked confused. Even your person frowned. Then a phone was connected to a speaker. A file appeared on the screen. Nobody knew what it was. Nobody knew why it was about to be played. But the moment the audio started, your person's entire body went still. Because the voice coming through those speakers was yours. And what happened next was something nobody could have prepared for. The recording wasn't recent. It wasn't planned. It wasn't something you ever expected anyone important to hear. It was a private moment. A hidden moment. A moment when you thought nobody was listening. Yet somehow, it had found its way into the most important room possible. And as your voice echoed through the speakers, your person felt their heart begin to race. Not because they were angry. Not because they were embarrassed. But because for the first time, they were hearing the truth. The truth you never intended them to hear. The recording began simply. You sounded tired. Exhausted. Like someone carrying emotions that had become too heavy. There was a long silence. Then your voice spoke. And every word hit harder than anyone expected. You talked about mistakes. You talked about regrets. You talked about moments you wished you could change. You talked about conversations that never happened. Messages that were never sent. Feelings that were never fully explained. The room listened quietly. But your person wasn't just listening. They were reliving. Every memory. Every argument. Every goodbye. Every unfinished chapter. Because suddenly they realized something terrifying. For months. Maybe years. They had been believing a version of the story that wasn't true. And now, the real story was unfolding in front of everyone. Word by word. Sentence by sentence. Truth by truth. The person sitting across from them for the marriage introduction slowly stopped smiling. The families stopped whispering. Even the people who had never met you became completely absorbed. Because there was something impossible to fake about your voice. Something raw. Something honest. Something deeply human. Then the recording reached a moment nobody saw coming. Your voice cracked. And you admitted something. Something you had never admitted publicly. Something you had hidden from almost everyone. You said, "If they were happy without me, I would accept it." The room fell silent. You continued. Because real love isn't controlling someone's future. A few people exchanged glances. Your person looked down. Their hands were trembling. But the recording wasn't finished. Not even close. Because the next part hit even harder. You spoke about growth. You spoke about becoming stronger. You spoke about learning lessons through heartbreak. And then you said something that felt as though it reached directly into your person's soul. You said, "I don't want them to choose me because they're lonely." Silence. "I don't want them to choose me because they're afraid." Silence. "I want them to choose me only if their heart keeps finding its way back." At that exact moment, your person stopped breathing for a second. Because nobody in that room knew the secret they were carrying. Nobody knew how many times they had tried to move forward. Nobody knew how many new beginnings had failed. Nobody knew how many nights your name appeared in their thoughts. Nobody knew. But they knew. And hearing those words felt almost impossible. Because those were the exact questions they had been struggling with. The exact fears. The exact confusion. The exact truth. Meanwhile, the recording continued. And every second made the atmosphere heavier. More emotional. More undeniable. You weren't begging. You weren't chasing. You weren't demanding anything. You were simply speaking honestly. And somehow, that honesty was becoming more powerful than any speech anyone else in that room had given. Then came the moment that changed everything. The moment people would talk about long after that evening ended. You paused. Took a deep breath. And said, "Maybe we're not meant to end up together." Your person's heart sank. Several people nodded. Some assumed that was the conclusion. The ending. The acceptance. But then you finished the sentence. "But if life ever brings us back to the same doorway again, I won't pretend I don't recognize home." The room froze. Completely. Utterly. Frozen. Because suddenly nobody was listening to a recording anymore. They were witnessing something deeper. A truth. A connection. A feeling. Something impossible to manufacture. And for the first time that night, your person looked emotional. Really emotional. Not polite. Not composed. Not controlled. Emotional. Because they realized something terrifying. Every attempt to forget you had failed. Every attempt to replace you had failed. Every attempt to erase the connection had failed. And hearing your voice again only proved it. The person they were being introduced to noticed. Everyone noticed. The room noticed. Because some truths become impossible to hide once they are spoken aloud. Then another revelation emerged. The relative who had played the recording finally explained where it came from. Months earlier, they had accidentally heard it. And something about it stayed with them. Not because it was dramatic. Not because it was perfect. But because it felt real. So real that they couldn't ignore it. And now, watching your person sit across from someone new, they felt the truth deserved to be heard before any major decision was made. Nobody expected the effect it would have. Especially not your person. Because while everyone else was hearing your words, they were hearing memories. The first conversation. The first smile. The first moment they realized you mattered. The moments nobody else knew existed. The moments they never admitted they still thought about. The moments that refused to disappear. Then something happened that nobody predicted. Your person stood up. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just quietly. Slowly. Almost as if they were following a feeling they could no longer ignore. The room watched. Families watched. The new person watched. Everyone watched. And after a long silence, your person spoke. The words were simple. But they changed everything. I thought I had moved on. Silence. I was wrong. The room felt smaller. The air felt heavier. The truth felt unavoidable. Because suddenly the evening was no longer about introductions. It was no longer about expectations. It was no longer about appearances. It was about the one thing nobody could control. The heart. And hearts have a strange habit. They remember what the mind tries to forget. They remember voices. They remember feelings. They remember unfinished stories. They remember people. Even when years pass. Even when distance grows. Even when logic says otherwise. And in that moment, your person finally stopped running from what they already knew. Because sometimes one recording changes everything. Not because it creates love, but because it reveals the love that was already there. The love hiding underneath pride. Underneath fear. Underneath silence. Underneath time itself. And as that realization settled into the room, everyone understood something they hadn't understood before. The story was never over. It had only been waiting. Waiting for truth. Waiting for courage. Waiting for one moment powerful enough to bring everything hidden into the light. And on that night, with your voice echoing through the speakers, that moment finally arrived. The silence after those words felt endless. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the people who had arrived expecting a simple marriage introduction now felt as though they had been pulled into something much bigger. Something real. Something unfinished. Your person remained standing. Their eyes fixed on the floor. Not because they were ashamed, but because they were fighting a battle that nobody else could see. A battle between what everyone expected them to do and what their heart had been trying to tell them for a very long time. The families exchanged nervous glances. The person sitting across from them looked confused. They hadn't done anything wrong. They were kind, respectful, successful. Everything looked perfect on paper. But sometimes the problem isn't that someone new is wrong. Sometimes the problem is that someone else still occupies a space in your heart that nobody can replace. And that realization was now impossible to ignore. Then one of the elders finally broke the silence. "What are you trying to say?" The question hung in the air. Your person swallowed hard. For a moment, it seemed as though they might stay quiet. As though they might retreat. As though they might pretend none of this had happened. But then they did something unexpected. They looked directly at the speaker that had played your recording. And they smiled. Not a happy smile. Not a sad smile. A smile of recognition. The smile of someone who had just found a missing piece of themselves. Then they spoke. And every person in that room leaned forward. I spent so much time convincing myself that the chapter was over. Silence. I told myself it was done. Silence. I told myself I had accepted it. Silence. But hearing that recording made me realize something. Their voice shook. Not dramatically. Just enough for everyone to know these words were real. I never stopped carrying them with me. The room went still again. Because everyone could feel the honesty. The rawness. The truth. And truth has a strange power. When it's genuine, people recognize it immediately. One of the relatives sighed. Another lowered their eyes. The person introduced for marriage sat quietly. They understood. Because sometimes the kindest thing someone can do is tell the truth before making promises they cannot keep. Then came another surprise. The relative who had played the recording wasn't finished. There is something else. The room turned. Confusion spread again. Another recording appeared on the screen. Your person frowned. They had no idea what this was. Nobody did. The relative pressed play. And once again, your voice filled the room. But this recording was different. Very different. The first recording had been emotional. Reflective. Thoughtful. This one was something else entirely. This one contained a secret. A secret nobody expected. Not even your person. The recording began with laughter. Your laughter. Soft. Genuine. The kind of laughter that only appears when someone is completely unguarded. Then your voice became serious. You were speaking to a close friend. A conversation you never imagined anyone else would hear. And then, you said something that made your person's heart stop. If they ever came back. A pause. I wouldn't ask them why they left. The room became silent again. Your friend in the recording sounded surprised. Really? You laughed softly. No. Another pause. Because if someone finds their way back despite everything, then maybe life already asked all the questions that matter. Your person's eyes closed. Because they knew exactly what those words meant. There was no anger in them. No revenge. No scorekeeping. No bitterness. Only understanding. Only growth. Only maturity. And suddenly your person realized how much you had changed. Not just changed. Evolved. While everyone else focused on the past. You had quietly become someone stronger. Someone wiser. Someone who no longer needed to chase. Someone who no longer needed to prove anything. The recording continued. And then came the revelation nobody expected. Your friend asked a question. A question that caused the entire room to hold its breath. Do you still love them? Several people shifted in their seats. The room felt frozen. Your person couldn't move. Couldn't blink. Couldn't even look away. Because they needed to hear the answer. They needed it more than anyone. A long silence followed. And then your voice responded. I don't know if love ever completely disappears. The room became impossibly quiet. You continued. I think it changes. Pause. It grows. Pause. It becomes less about possession and more about wishing someone well. The families listened. The guests listened. But your person wasn't listening anymore. They were remembering. Remembering every version of you they had ever known. The old you. The younger you. The hurt you. The hopeful you. And suddenly they realized something shocking. The person they had been missing wasn't just a memory anymore. You had become someone entirely new. Someone they hadn't fully met yet. Then another unexpected moment arrived. The recording ended. The room remained silent. Nobody knew what to say. Nobody knew what to do. Because the evening had transformed into something nobody planned. And then your person made a decision. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Quietly. The way the most important decisions are often made. They reached into their pocket. Pulled out their phone. And stared at it. The screen reflected in their eyes. A single name sat there. Your name. A name they had not contacted in a very long time. A name they had looked at countless times. A name they had almost called 100 different nights. But never did. The room watched. Waiting. Holding its breath. Your person's thumb hovered over the screen. And suddenly fear appeared. Real fear. Because reaching out meant risking rejection. It meant risking disappointment. It meant risking discovering that too much time had passed. That everything was truly over. But another thought appeared. A stronger thought. What if it wasn't? What if the recording wasn't the ending? What if it was the beginning? The beginning of a conversation that should have happened long ago. The beginning of answers. The beginning of clarity. The beginning of truth. And in that moment, your person realized something profound. The greatest regret in life is rarely failure. It's silence. It's the words left unsaid. It's the chances never taken. It's wondering forever what might have happened. And they were no longer willing to live with that question. Not anymore. So they stood, looked around the room, and spoke one final time. I can't promise what happens next. Everyone listened. I can't promise a perfect ending. Silence. I can't promise they'll even want to hear from me. Silence. But I owe it to myself to find out. The room remained motionless. Because deep down, everyone understood. Some journeys aren't about certainty. They're about courage. The courage to seek the truth. The courage to face your feelings. The courage to stop hiding. And for the first time in a very long time, your person felt brave enough to do exactly that. They took a deep breath, pressed a button, and watched the screen. The call began to ring. 1 ring. 2 rings. 3 rings. Every heartbeat felt louder. Every second felt longer. The room held its breath. Nobody knew what would happen next. Nobody knew whether you would answer. Nobody knew whether destiny was about to open a door, or close one forever. Then suddenly, the ringing stopped. Your person's eyes widened. The room froze. And from the other side of the line, a familiar voice quietly said, "Hello?" The entire world seemed to disappear. Because after everything, after the distance, after the silence, after the misunderstandings, after the years, the connection was still there. Alive. Waiting. And what happened after that single word would change both of your lives forever.